All right. Cornelius Vanderbilt. I would highly recommend this book, which probably is backwards in the screen, but this is called The Myth of the Robber Barons, a new look at the rise of big business in America by Burton Folsom. It's a great book, great history describing that kind of robber baron era I've noticed as a history teacher and in my own education that since history in eighth and grade ends up at the Civil War and then picks up kind of in the 1900s, kind of a little bit in the 1800s, but kind of goes after Civil War. There's this kind of gap for me between 1877 and really, I would say, World War One of what all that happens in here. And I'm sure I've gone over this stuff, but in there you hear, okay, this was the time of the rise of big business and monopolies and robber barons and men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and men like uh, the railroad, builders, which some of them were robber barons, and we'll discuss that. And the Scrantons and Charles Schwab and Rockefeller and all these people who are supposedly these robber barons. And this book is so good because it goes through and actually details what they did and shows that these men were not robber barons. They were in it for the money, but that is what business is. But they were also in it to get the money through serving the consumer, not through being in bed with government and getting government tax money and subsidies to accomplish their goals. And so this really lays this case out and historically and footnotes it because the typical cartoonish picture that you'd get from an American history textbook is this: there were these big businesses, there were many, who came in and created unfair competition by being so big and investing in their various industries so much that became uh, huge parts of American life and otherwise, think of the railroad, think of oil, how important those commodities became, and that they became monopolies through participating in what's called predatory pricing, which is that they set their prices really low, really, really low, so no one could compete with them. And then after all their would-be competitors or existing competitors went out of the market, they raised their prices way up so that they could make more money. And predatory pricing is actually a myth that never happens. You can go through, and I'll go through it another time, hopefully, and detail how that has never worked. It's never been successful when it's been tried. And they also accuse these businessmen and entrepreneurs of working together in trusts, that they would give each other special deals and things like this, and that they would be agreeing on prices together in order so that they could pocket more profit, pocket more money, which ironically, during the New Deal basically has a bunch of businesses come in and legally sit down with governments and say, okay, let's put together a trust. But I digress from that a little bit. Let me move my screen up. I'm not sure how this is going to work. One of the reasons I want to do this is one to talk about the subject, but another reason is that I enjoy reading these books, but I'm not always good at going back over them and talking about them in a way that's coherent and possibly helpful. So I want to have the opportunity to do that, to discuss that, and to look at Vanderbilt. So let me see if this will work. I'm not seeing myself on here. Let's see, because I opened my screenshot. Okay. I don't know if I'm still down at the corner of this page or whatever the case is. But anyway, I'm going to go on. Let's talk about Cornelius Vanderbilt and his steamships and his anti-monopoly. He's actually called, at one point, I have a quote in here, of the greatest anti-monopolist because he's setting the price so low, he's actually breaking up the state monopolies. And think about what a monopoly is for a minute. Okay, let me describe the steamship industry during this time. So the steamship industry is America's first large-scale business, one of the first. And it becomes mechanized in the early 1800s. That the instead of wind power, instead of rowing, instead of any other type of power that you had to depend on to get across the ocean or a river, steam power allowed for a wheel to turn and to paddle the boat forward. And so it was really the cutting edge of the technology, and it was really highly competitive. Anyone could get into the steamship business as long as they entered, as long as they had a steamship and they could compete, and people kept going to them. Um, Now, this is probably the most important sentence of the book from Folsom. He differentiates between two types of entrepreneurs. Um, so the idea may be that, as I make this, I'm all in favor of big business, but that's not true. I'm not in favor of big business in and of itself at all, in that except insofar as it is peaceful and just, and it works through just transactions, meaning that it works in a voluntary way, that it works in an honest way. It actually gives people what it says that it's providing to them, that it works in a way that of mutual benefit. Okay, all of those that are true for Vanderbilt, but they're not true for all the steamship companies that existed during this time. They're not true for all companies. Now think in your head back to when you used to play a board game, make your family angry at you, you at them, the classic family board game Monopoly. Okay, now what is a monopoly? Now we hear obviously the Latin word mono, meaning one, in there, but is that all that a monopoly is? It's just one company doing something. And there are really two types of monopolies, and one's not a true monopoly. One type of monopoly is that you're really good. You're the best. Everybody buys from you because you serve the consumer very well. You serve them so well that they don't have any interest in buying from anyone else. Now, there's a little bit of nuance here, but there's a reason not that many people use Bing and Yahoo as search engines, and everybody goes to Google. It's because, in a sense, Google is the best. Now, I'm not saying Google doesn't have some monopolistic tendencies, but that is an example of how a monopoly may not be necessarily a bad thing, but you're negative for the consumer. Monopolies, you can imagine what difficulties there would be. I asked my students, what would it be? What would be the problem if just one company was allowed to create shoes? One company is allowed to create shoes, and you can only legally buy shoes from this company. Okay, I guess you can make them yourself, but really there's only one company that does it. What would be the issues with that? And they come up with issues of price. There's no incentive to and competition to keep the prices down. And it doesn't mean that the people in monopolies are bad people, but when there's no external pressure to keep the prices down, cost is cost. It doesn't matter. And quality, same thing. They may be honest people who want to give people good quality shoes, but again, there are no access. There's no access to alternatives. There's no other options. So therefore, the quality is what it is. It doesn't matter. It also means, in terms of customer service, all these types of things, that because it's guaranteed existence, its loyalty is not necessarily to the customer as an entity. Its loyalty is to the entity that keeps it in existence. So a true monopoly can only exist when it is created and maintained by the legal force of government. Okay. Now, government is highly involved in the industry of steamships and steam power in America and England from the beginning. They get their hands in it almost immediately. And as I said before, the most important sentence of the book is where Folsom differentiates between political entrepreneurs and market entrepreneurs. He writes about political entrepreneurs. These are people who try to succeed in business. So far, so good, nothing wrong with that, but try to succeed in business through federal aid, pools, vote buying, and subsidies. Meaning, business wants to guarantee income, perfectly natural incentive. They want to guarantee customers coming back to them, perfectly natural incentive. They want to limit competition, natural incentive if you're doing it in a way of being the best. That's how you limit competition. Be better. Offer alternatives. Offer cheaper solutions. Offer lower prices. Offer more quality. But political entrepreneurs see these three incentives that all businesses have and see the answer in that through government, through legislation. Government can guarantee income through taxation. It taxes others and grants guaranteed income. It can also give them subsidies. It can make what they do cheaper, which means they may produce way too much. How would we know? Well, they're not basing it off of supply and demand anymore. Who's buying what, where, when, how much? They're basing it off of how much money are we going to be able to get. And now they become a bureaucracy trying to expand their program rather than someone trying to serve someone else for mutual benefit for themselves. Um, and so people talk about greed all the time. Well, what's greedier? A system in which people have to vote with their dollars and you have to give them something that they want in order to be successful, or something that guarantees you will have money no matter what you produce and how well you work with the government. It also works with vote buying. Who is going to be more persuasive and be able to guarantee more political capital to a politician? Little you with your phone call and your email and your letter and your vote, or a large company that can offer tons of money to someone to support them. And this creates this cycle within government and business that can be very close friends when they want to be. And they can also create government can also come in and create regulation that limits competition. That these big companies love big regulation because big regulation means for them that they don't have to compete and that other people will not step into their space. It's a legally granted monopoly. Those are political entrepreneurs, those who use the power of government in order to guarantee that their business is successful and limit competition. Okay, so it's not that's not an entrepreneur. That is not a free market. That is not capitalism. A market entrepreneur are those who, according to Folsom, try to succeed in business by creating and marketing a superior product or service at a low cost. And these two are in competition with one another from the beginning. They're always enemies. And there's they have totally different incentives and totally different perspectives in order to um, achieve their goals. Okay, now back to the steamships in particular. Robert Fulton is the first one to build and operate a steamboat on New York waters. So New York is kind of where a lot of this is happening in the rivers, and the Hudson in particular. He builds the Claremont that travels on the Hudson River in 1807 at the whopping speed of 4 miles per hour. Okay, but you got to think, if you can go up, now that doesn't sound much to us, but if you can go up river, now you're not faced with current or wind or rowing. You can now go up river, down river, 4 miles an hour. It's pretty good. But Fulton has a monopoly. He is the only one allowed to operate on New York waters because the state grants him a monopoly. And New York, the legislator, gives him the privilege of carrying all steamboat traffic for 30 years. They give him a 30-year monopoly where no one else is allowed to do it. And so Fulton operates steamboat. But again, no incentive to bring down costs, not that he's necessarily a bad guy. The incentive to take a monopoly from the government is natural as far as it goes, but there's no incentive to improve the technology or to offer a lower cost or to make things faster or better. It's just about a matter of incentives, not a matter of individual morality. And so he has this monopoly. Later on, Thomas Gibbons decides he wants to break the monopoly. Now, maybe you've heard, if you remember in government, which is to be pretty good to remember this, remember from government class, there's a case called Gibbons versus Ogden, which is about whether or not, based on interstate commerce, whether or not the Supreme Court or the state of New York is able to grant this monopoly when the boats go out of state waters and come back into New York state waters, or whether that's a federal issue. And they decide eventually in Gibbons versus Ogden, this lawsuit that comes before the Supreme Court, that it's interstate commerce, therefore there can be no state monopoly. Now, while that's a good thing in one sense, it does break up a state monopoly, it is also an assumption of federal power, meaning the federal government, which is also a monopoly, it's a legal and forceful monopoly on coercion, assumes more powers, and that's going to be an issue in several cases, just as it was an issue with the state of New York. So Gibbons hires this young guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt in 1817 to run steamships in New York and charge less than the monopoly. So he's like, if you're able to do it, charge less than them, and we're going to challenge their monopolies. Okay, so this guy is not a monopolist. He is the opposite of a monopolist. He's bringing competition to a monopoly system, albeit illegally. And Gibbons versus Ogden, as I said, the Supreme Court ruled to strike down the monopoly since the Constitution regulated interstate commerce. Now, steamboat traffic, after the monopolies struck down, remember, the one guy is allowed to do it for 30 years, carry all steamboat traffic. Now the steamboat traffic doubles because everybody enters the business. That's the incentive to do it. Imagine that there's one movie theater that's legally allowed to be in town. They can charge whatever they want for tickets. They don't have to build more seats. They don't have to offer more quality. And they may offer fine quality and they may offer reasonable prices. But if a movie theater is by itself, let's imagine that it charges $100 a ticket to get in. Well, if it's the only one, $100 is $100. They decide based on how much money they think they can get. But if someone else is allowed to build a movie theater in town with them or right next door to them, what might they do? They might charge lower prices, they might offer higher quality, or they might do both, which puts downward pressure on the price, which is good news for the consumer. That's what happened with the steamboat traffic. After the monopoly was struck down, everybody saw, hey, you could make some pretty good money in the steamboat business. They all get in it, start competing with each other, and the price is forced down by that pressure of competition. It in the second year on the Ohio River, it quadrupled. And so technology is also improving. They're trying to figure out how to do it faster. They're trying to do it better. They're trying to offer things on the steamships like food and entertainment that other things, uh, other boats were not offering. The expense of fuel was cut down by one half. Now, how come they didn't figure that out when Fulton had his 30-year monopoly? That you could find a better way of doing fuel and cut down on half the cost. Well, when you're a monopoly, what's the point? What's the incentive? There's no reason to even start looking for something like that because there's no forces of competition and downward pressure on the price. It costs what it costs. So costs began to drop significantly. Costs were cut quite a bit. Passenger traffic dropped from the cost of $7 to about $3. Okay. Now Fulton's group, they go bankrupt because they're not able to keep up. See, this 30-year monopoly that had been granted to this one person by special government privilege from the state of New York was not necessarily better for the consumers because it was regulated. It was actually not necessarily purposefully, but it was actually worse for them. It was more expensive. And he was not able to compete when it came down to a real matter of competition. Gibbons and Vanderbilt, they adopt new technology, they cut costs, and they're each earning $40,000 a year in profit. They're making a ton of money in their profits. Okay? And they're being rewarded because they're treating the consumers very well. They're offering them something superior quality at a lower cost. That's what competition does. Vanderbilt is not a robber baron. Oh, but he's going to raise the prices. No, the prices only continue to get cheaper and the technology only continues to get better. And what's he going to raise the prices from before? 3 to 7? You know, what people never question when they talk about predatory pricing. Oh, these businesses are coming in, they're going to lower the prices and they're going to charge monopoly prices once they're the last one. Nobody ever questions, well, not ever, but hardly anybody ever says, well, what the heck? Why is it okay for a government-imposed monopoly to charge us higher prices? But it's not even okay to theoretically uh, imagine that competition would force prices so low that they might eventually come a little bit back up. I mean, if they went to $4, would that really be so bad? They were still cheaper than the original 7 under a government monopoly. So these are just some things to think about. Vanderbilt bought 2 steamboats and goes into business for himself. He creates a New York to Philadelphia route. He becomes the standard. He doesn't go he doesn't raise prices. In fact, he lowers them and goes from $3 to $1. There's a New Brunswick to New York route. He only charges 6 cents and provides free meals. This guy's providing free food and charging people 6 cents. Why? Well, it adds up from the other lines that he has, and it is beneficial for him to put more pressure on the other steamboat companies. He's going to become the only one because he's doing it the best. In New York, Vanderbilt cut rates from $3 to $1 to 10 cents to free. People are being offered free steamboat rides because it was assumed that they would buy food or that the other lines would make up for the costs there. It cost him about 200. He was scrupulous about the costs, about figuring out how much it would cost and figuring out all those calculations. It cost him about $200 a day to operate the boats. So at least 100, if he figured out, okay, if 100 passengers ride. They buy about $2 of food each. That's it. I've covered my costs for the day, and anything beyond that is clean profit. In the midst of this, Vanderbilt is going to a restaurant to get French fries, and it keeps asking for them to be cut thinner and thinner and fried more. And the chef finally gets mad and cuts them so thin that he fries them up and creates the potato chip. And so Vanderbilt has a hand in inventing the potato chip, which becomes a food that's offered on his steamships. So charging such low prices put this enormous pressure on competitors, as I've already said. Many bought out uh, Vanderbilt in exchange for leaving an area. They said, "Hey, we'll give you a ton of money just to not operate your steamships here at such low prices." Some quotes about Vanderbilt from the time, or he's called the greatest practical anti-monopolist in the country. So he's the exact opposite of a monopolist and the exact opposite of a robber baron. And then he says, this is a quote from him in the Harper's Weekly from 1859. He says, "If I could not run a steamship alongside another man and do it as well as he for 20% less than it cost him, I would leave the ship." Meaning he got his jollies, he got his excitement, he got his adrenaline from the competition itself, of doing things better and being the best. So this does not fit the picture of the typical 8th grade, 11th grade textbook that tells us that Vanderbilt's just this monopolist, this robber baron who's just trying to uh, do harm to the consumer. No, that just doesn't fit the narrative, because the narrative isn't true. Um, Okay, there I am again. So, uh, what this book defines in sees in Vanderbilt is the key difference, and other men, as I'll show, the key difference between a political entrepreneur and a market entrepreneur. Now, remember, political entrepreneurs are those who use the force of government to guarantee that their business is granted special privileges, which means tax money, which means subsidies. Same thing, it's just a different way of saying it. And which means usually corruption, because now the politicians who are supposed to represent the people are now representing these businesses. A market entrepreneur is someone who's trying to offer a superior product or service at a lower cost in order to serve the consumers. And are they in it for themselves? Of course they are. Everybody's in that self-regarding way. That's one of the first lessons of economics, is that people work by incentives. People work by self-interest. And why shouldn't people they should just operate steamboats for uh, the good of mankind? No, they operate steamboats because they want to make money. That's their incentive to do it. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a natural incentive in the world that's been created. What's not natural, or ought not to be natural, is the wanting to use the force of government to accomplish those incentives. So that's it for Folsom and for this particular video. Be on the lookout for ones on the other so-called robber barons.